Welcome, and I welcome you to ISWI 2021, and for another keynote lecture. We are now at the fourth day of ISWI, and I'm happy to welcome Kristina with us, Kristina Roesel. She's from ILRI, that's the International Livestock Research Institute, and we will talk today about zoonosis. We will talk today about how they are combined with climate change, how they are evolving here. We are in the midst of a pandemic, so I think this topic is super relevant also for us, and hopefully we will come out of this pandemic, but maybe there's some more to come. And all these things Kristina will address. She's an expert in this field, has her PhD in biomedical science of the Freie Universität Berlin, and is apparently now in Nairobi, situated in Kenya. And there she's conceptualizing One Health Institute for whole Africa, what is super impressive, and also leads investment for an approval in animal and human health in Uganda. And I'm happy to welcome you here, and would give you just a word to enlighten us with what you find out, and maybe how to prevent next zoonosis.
Thank you, Andy, for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone online. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here today to talk about the topic preventing the next pandemic and how to break the chain of transmission of zoonotic diseases, which is a report that was published last year on behalf of the Animal and Human Health Program at the International Livestock Research Institute. So it's not my report. I'm talking here on behalf of my colleagues in Nairobi and globally. Before I go into the report and the drivers of pandemics, I wanted to quickly introduce to you who is ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. I wanted to bring us all on the same page about the terminology on infectious diseases, so we have the same understanding of the words that we use in infectious diseases. And then I will dive into the report and introduce to you the 7 drivers of pandemics that we have explained in depth in that report I'm talking about. And I'll also give you some recommendations from the report on how we think we can break the chain of transmission and how to prevent the next pandemic. And this is basically adding up to ILRI's One Health approach, which I'm just going to finish with at the end of my talk. So the International Livestock Research Institute has been there for almost 5 decades now, and it's one of 15 research centers that work in the Global South, conducting agricultural research for development. So we are trying to improve food security and livelihoods of farmers across the Global South for better lives and better health. And in this consortium, which is funded by international development agencies in high-income countries, as well as bilateral grants, competitive research grants, we are implementing our work. And these 15 centers are working on different commodities that are relevant in agriculture. For example, there's an International Rice Research Institute, one in Africa, one in Asia. We have a sweet potato center in Latin America. We have an international or World Fish Center in Malaysia. We have the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And ILRI is the only center of those 15 working with livestock and how to improve livestock health and productivity for better livelihoods and nutrition. And if you can see from this map, we work in the Global South, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And this is also where most of the global poor livestock keepers are located. And at least 1.3 billion people in the world today depend on livestock for their livelihoods and for food. And our research is aiming at securing these assets, protecting animals from disease, but also improving productivity through health interventions and to increase the market participation by those poor livestock farmers. So the Livestock Center is always an element of a lot of global arguments now. We shouldn't eat meat, greenhouse gases, and the rest of it. And I think we can go into this discussion after the talk. But the livestock sector also provides poor farmers with a lot of opportunities. For example, micronutrients can mostly be found in milk, meat, eggs, and fish. There is a big potential for regional economic development because there's always demand for meat, for hides, for hooves, and other products coming from livestock. We can use manure for the nutrient cycle of the soils, to refertilize them, and we can get regenerative energies from manure and other livestock byproducts. And of course, all these things come with challenges such as overconsumption, zoonotic diseases, land and water degradation, pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. There's always two sides of the story. However, some of the examples that I want to quickly mention to you so you can see what do we do when we talk about livestock for development. I'm giving you a few examples. On the bottom left, you see red and white sheep. And this is actually a crossbreed that we have developed with our genetics program in Kenya. It's a crossbreed of the red Maasai sheep, which is resistant to gastrointestinal parasites, basically worms in the stomach. And those worms usually really reduce productivity of those sheep and increase mortality of these sheep. So we crossbred this red Maasai sheep, an indigenous breed, with a meat-producing Dorper sheep from South Africa and Saudi Arabia to have a breed that is resistant to disease constraints in the local environment, needs less drugs, but will still thrive and give the farmer meat for money. Another example of the work we're doing is through remote sensing. We are measuring vegetation indices in very arid regions of northern Kenya and Ethiopia in East Africa to estimate the vegetation cover and to predict how much fodder is available for the pastoralists and their animals in the next season, in the next dry season. And based on these vegetation indices, we developed an insurance model so that pastoralists that heavily rely on the climate and that are losing animals if there's drought, they can pay a premium and they actually get an insurance cover in times of drought. So through that, we're trying to improve resilience of those pastoralists. Also, for the last couple of decades, we have worked a lot on parasitic diseases, on diagnostics, on vaccines, for example, African swine fever. And just recently, we have actually helped the Ministry of Health in Kenya, where one of our headquarters is, in using veterinary laboratories to test for COVID. So in veterinary science, we use the same testing approaches. So we were just reutilizing our vet labs in Nairobi to help the Ministry of Health in the testing and surveillance of COVID in Kenya. So we're located mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Our two main headquarters are in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and in Nairobi in Kenya. And we have 12 other offices across the globe and approximately 600 staff and almost 50-50 men and women. So this is ISWI. Now we start with a little crash course on infectious disease terminology. And to give you an overall picture, COVID is an infectious disease. But actually, the bigger burden of diseases comes from non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable means not infectious. They are not transmitted from one person or from one mammal to another, whereas communicable diseases are infectious diseases. And non-communicable diseases are those diabetes, cardiovascular problems, obesity, all these things that are largely driven by behavior, but also lifestyle choices, etc. Cancer, for example, most cancers are non-communicable. And the burden of the non-communicable disease is actually by far bigger these days. And zoonoses are now communicable, infectious diseases, and they can be transmitted between different animal species. And a zoonotic disease in the classical sense, when we talk about zoonosis, it's a disease that can be transmitted from animals to humans. However, I want to remind you of one of the mottos of this conference. It's respect nature. So humans are mammals, and we are one of many mammals. So we are not only suffering from infectious diseases that jump from other non-human animals or mammals, but we are also infecting other mammals with our diseases. So for example, your guinea pig might die of herpes virus. Pet animals can suffer from TB, from human TB. Wildlife also is affected by human TB. So this is what we call reverse zoonosis. But when we talk about zoonotic diseases, usually we consider those animals jumping from animals to humans. And the next terminus I wanted to clarify is the spillover event and the term mutation. Mutation always sounds like, it reminds many people of genetically modified, something artificial, but mutation is actually a very normal part of evolution. There's always been mutation because any organism wanted to survive in the environment. So they had to find strategies and adapt to their environment to survive and reproduce. So over time, there's always been mutations. And some organisms, they adapt to their environment in a slower pace, and some adapt to it in a much faster pace. So for example, these coronaviruses, they're very tiny RNA viruses, and they reproduce very fast. So, of course, the faster you reproduce, the more errors can occur in the genetic material. And then in the course of these mutations, they can develop mechanisms that enable them to enter another organism, infect another organism, and these are what we call virulence factors. Lastly, what is a pandemic? A pandemic is basically a global epidemic. And to understand what an epidemic is, you have to look at a population. There's usually some diseases usually circulating in that disease, in that population. And then suddenly, for example, the seasonal flu, you have a spike. You have more cases than usual in a population. And that's what we call an epidemic. So you have a sudden increase in cases, and that's an epidemic. So if a disease is there, usually at a lower level, it's an endemic. It's always there in that area. Colleagues joining from Pakistan, India, they might know foot and mouth disease. It's endemic in many countries. An epidemic is a spike in cases, and a pandemic is when an epidemic spreads globally. So in this graph, you can actually see an endemic. It's this light pinkish curve. You have a pathogen, for example, in wild animals. Let's take, for example, HIV. We know HIV emerged from non-human primates. It's likely been there for a long time. And then suddenly there was a spillover event. So somehow that HIV virus had to get in touch with an intermediate host or humans. Very likely that it occurred through hunters-gatherers that invaded the ecosystem of those non-human primates, and that's where the spillover event occurs. It's basically like a traffic accident. So two organisms collided, and then there was an exchange of pathogens. So, and then of course, HIV is a different kind of global epidemic because it went at a much slower pace. So coronaviruses, for example, they spread much faster. So we could immediately see there's a spike in cases. There's a first wave, second wave, third wave. With HIV, it had to reintegrate its RNA into the host DNA. And so that took a lot of time. And the onset of AIDS comes much later. So now we are all on the same page. We all know the basic infectious disease terminology, and we're going right into the report. And that report was published by the International Livestock Research Institute last year in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme. And the lead author is Dr. Delia Grace Randolph. She has been an ILRI scientist for a long time, the program co-leader of the Animal Human Health Program in Nairobi, and she's now a joint appointee with the Natural Resources Institute in the UK in Greenwich. And there was a lot of input from colleagues in HUNEP, conservation agencies, and ILRI. So this study, you can find the full report, open access, online. You can download it. I have put the link at one of the slides. And this report identified and described 7 drivers of pandemics. So driver number 1, I'm going to take you through all of those now. Driver number 1 is the increasing demand for animal protein. So animal protein is fish, eggs, milk, meat, of course. And this is driven by 2 factors. One, it's the global population, which is dramatically growing. So it's just the sheer numbers. If you look at the numbers of in the 1900s, we didn't even have 2 billion people living on this planet. Now we have almost 10 billion. This is just in like 100 years. And by 2000, by the 22nd century, we'll have 11 billion people living on this planet. And already now in Asia, India and China have the bulk of the Asian population. And you can see Africa is a relatively small population, considering it's the 2nd largest continent in the world. But Africa's population is projected to grow or to double by 2050. And 2050 is not too far in the future. So just the sheer number of people eating meat, eating the same amount of meat, of course, results in higher demand of meat. But also wealth and health are slowly changing and improving. So if people have more money, also they would like to eat more meat and other animal source food. So you can see from this graph, this study was conducted by the International Food Policy Research Institute, a sister organization of ILRI. You can see that the per capita consumption of meat, these are the red bars on the left side, they're not really changing. So there's not going to be, by 2050, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa at the bottom, there's not an extreme change in meat consumption or animal source protein. But of course, if the population doubles, the consumption by the continent, on the continent, will double. The second driver of pandemics is an unsustainable agricultural intensification. What does that mean? So one aspect of it is that we are trying to select livestock breeds, for example, pigs or dairy cows, because they are known for their very high yields, for example, milk yields or meat yields, or they lay a lot of eggs, so we keep a certain breed of chickens. However, if you have a population or a flock with genetically very similar animals, if a disease enters, it will wipe out the entire flock. So if you have a more genetically diverse or heterogeneous population, a disease will not likely to kill off many, because some of them will have a good either resistance, natural resistance, or they have immunological factors fighting off a disease. So keeping many animals of the same breed is definitely a problem, but also crowding them into places like bird batteries, for example. Crowding increases stress. Stress makes animals more susceptible to infections. Often also we know that these hygienic problems are masked with antimicrobials, and this is not, it's a global problem as well, even in the global south. So that can also increase the selection pressure on some of these bacteria and or viruses and result in antimicrobial resistance. Also, we have irrigation projects. There are many irrigation projects. As for me, I work mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, so there are many irrigation projects that help crop farming. However, they also give opportunities for mosquito species, for example, breeding in those irrigation channels. So even with irrigation, you would see there are always two sides. There is a good thing and a bad thing about any interventions, but something we need to consider. Irrigation can lead to increased outbreaks, for example, of Rift Valley fever in East Africa. And then also urbanization is a big driver of animals getting together with humans, especially in low and middle income countries. Many farmers, they bring the animals from the rural areas into the cities. And on that picture, you can see cattle grazing in the city of Nairobi. But that's not because the rural farmers don't have grazing land. It's because the Maasai herders, it is part of their natural territory. They've always come to Nairobi to graze the cattle, even before it became a city. So up to this day, they're moving with the rains and they bring their cattle into the city. So intensification, apparently, that's what I mentioned, is a big driver of disease emergence. And looking at this graph from the 1920s up to 2020, this is just a period of 100 years. On top, you see the coronaviruses. And at the bottom, you see other emerging infectious diseases that you have heard of. HIV, we mentioned, West Nile fever, Ebola virus, BSE, Nipah virus, avian influenza, they're at the bottom. But let's look at the coronaviruses on top. Coronavirus in chickens have already been reported in 1931. So that's a long time ago. And that coincided with the industrial or intensification of poultry production after the First World War. In pigs, they emerged 40 years later as part of the post-Second World War intensification wave in pigs. And they emerged, this disease was first reported from the United Kingdom. So coronaviruses in pigs. In livestock, they usually, the viruses, they cause diarrhea, especially in young animals. They also cause respiratory problems. And so you can see coronaviruses are not really a new thing. We have known them from veterinary science for quite some time. And in 2012, for example, a disease emerged in Saudi Arabia. We called it MERS, coronavirus, which is related to the coronavirus we are dealing with now. And we have looked into camel samples that we had stored at ILRI in Nairobi from the 1970s, 80s. And with the new diagnostics, we were able to see that these camels back in the 70s, 80s, they've already carried MERS coronavirus, but we didn't know about it until 2012. So if you look at this disease emergence, you might think, okay, the frequency of coronavirus outbreaks is now happening at a much faster pace, but we also have to consider we have much better diagnostics now, and also the population is bigger. So if we have outbreaks affecting more people or animal, it's likely to be reported. The third driver of zoonotic disease emergence is, of course, the increased use and exploitation of wildlife. I think that was one of the very obvious statements. If we are encroaching habitats of wild animals, the chances, the odds of spillover are much higher. So people go into forests and harvest animals, wild animals, for meat. If you are a hunter in East Africa, for example, living near a nice national park with bush pigs and antelopes, it's relatively low input to go into a national park and shoot an antelope for meat, rather than putting all the medication, getting feeds for your sheep and goats. So for some people, it's just the cheaper option to go and hunt animals. Of course, then we also have recreational hunting. These are the trophy hunters and those that are hunting for status. You have trade in live animals for pets, for zoos, and for research. And you have wildlife products that are traded for, just decorative medicinal use. For example, rhino horn or ivory, for example, big problem. And if you look at this graph here, 10,000 years ago, 99% of the biomass of the, vertebrate biomass on Earth was from wild animals and only 1% human. And these days is quite different. It's the opposite. 1% of the biomass is from wild animals, and the rest consists of humans and livestock. Driver number 4 is the unsustainable use of natural resources. Of course, it goes hand in hand with this unsustainable intensification. But this graphic, I find it very educating. It's also in the report, and you'll get a lot of very interesting references and examples. You read it from the left to the right. So the left shows a dense rainforest, for example, in Central Africa or in Indonesia, and then it's intruded by people. They either want to cut the trees, or they want to turn it into arable land, or they want to build houses or roads. And that's, of course, when they get much closer to wild animals. These can often be bats, for example, non-human primates. We heard about pangolins being stipulated as one of the potential reservoirs for coronaviruses. So this is, it happens. If you have more contact, if there are more interfaces, the likelihood increases that you get in touch with a pathogen that is not used to humans, and that then jumps species from wildlife that might not get sick from that pathogen, but humans might fall sick. Then in the next step, you have generalist species, and you have those expert species. So some species, they live in niches, and they're really sensitive to temperature changes, to humidity changes. But you have some species, for example, bats, certain bird species, rodents, they can live everywhere. And they will find new niches. They will go into peri-urban areas. They will live near homesteads. They will find new burrows. They will live off human waste, for example, or organic waste. And they don't mind living near human habitats. So, and those are the species that are very likely to then carry pathogens closer to humans, because they know how to live in human habitats. And this is where two approaches come in that we need to understand, and that's where biodiversity is very important, species biodiversity. First of all, disturbing habitats or fragmenting habitats will lead to co-evolution. So the spillover, the way I explained, there's always been contact between humans and wildlife, but usually in one big ecosystem. Now, if you have several roads going through a forest, you have several isolated areas where diseases can co-evolve. So instead of one spillover event, you might end up with 3, right? If you have 3 different fragmented ecosystems. And the same holds true for the dilution effect. I'm taking the example of West Nile fever, which is also an RNA virus transmitted by mosquitoes of the Culex anaetus species, and they're globally, they're at home on the globe. And these mosquitoes, they usually bite birds, certain bird species, to which they transmit the virus, and then the virus amplifies in those bird species. So not all bird species are equally susceptible to that virus. Not all bird species, when they're infected from the mosquito, they can amplify the virus. So the more different bird species you have, the higher the likelihood that a mosquito meets a bird that is not susceptible to that virus and cannot amplify the host. So that is what we call the dilution effect. And then, of course, you might wonder, okay, it's a bird disease. How does it affect humans? Humans and also horses, they are dead-end hosts. So the virus cannot reproduce or amplify in horses or humans. However, it does have an effect, and humans die. They develop encephalitis, they develop fever, and then, they can die, even though the virus is not amplifying in that host. So that is what we call the dilution effect. So co-evolution because of habitat fragmentation, and dilution because of less species diversity. Of course, travel and transportation, I think, is a global phenomenon, and I don't need to explain it a lot. Pathogens, they can travel faster than their incubation period. So if I'm traveling from Central Africa and I've been in contact with Ebola, by the time I reach China, I might not even show any signs of diseases, but I've already infected all my co-passengers on the plane. So that is just a very simple example. So the global air traffic has, of course, increased that pace of transmission. And as I said in the beginning, mutation has always been there, but the pace of transmission has really been accelerated by globalization. And globalization, of course, also changed the food supply systems. So if we look at Germany, for example, for me, I'm a vet. And in the past, the animals, the cows from our villages, they went to the nearest town, to the slaughterhouse, to be then, or to the butcher, and to be then sold to the end consumer. Now there are only a couple of very big slaughterhouses in the country, and animals travel through the entire republic to get slaughtered, and then they travel back to be sold in the supermarket. So these food supply chains have become much longer and much more complex. But the same holds true in low and middle income countries. In this example, we're taking milk. A lot of milk is produced in smallholder systems. And then traders go around, they collect the milk from different places, and then it's bulked again in different containers in milk collection centers, and then it's sold to the consumers. In some cultures, there is boiling or pasteurization. In other cultures, it's raw milk consumption, which can then lead to also foodborne disease. So if, for example, one cow that produced a liter of milk that was then sold to the market, bulked with other milk, was sick, the entire container, which contains the bulk milk, is contaminated. So that is also, the longer a chain gets, the more complicated things become. And in low and middle income countries, we don't have this traceability system that we have in Europe, for example, where we can exactly say this piece of meat is coming from that farm and that animal was treated with drug ABC. Then picking up from the talk on Saturday or yesterday, driver 7, the last driver, is climate change. And of course, that's a chicken and the egg question. And who caused climate change and what are the implications of this? But in terms of disease emergence, climate change mostly has an impact on vector-borne diseases. So a vector is, for example, a tick or a mosquito that is transmitting viral or parasitic diseases. Talking about malaria, for example, Rift Valley fever, or in Europe now we have problems with encephalitis virus, FSME. So if winters are warmer and ticks don't die, mosquitoes don't die, we will have problems with tropical diseases, of course, re-emerging here. We used to have malaria in Europe, but it was eradicated. And another problem, of course, is that the more droughts you have in pastoralist areas, the more people will come to the city for jobs and for growing their food. So this phenomenon of urbanization will increase even more. So summarizing, these are the 7 drivers of disease emergence. And you will see that they're all made by humans. Also, as Professor Fajib was saying yesterday, climate change is anthropogenic. It's made by humans. So, and that is also why we have to take the responsibility for fixing some of these drivers. And ILRI is trying to do that, or not just ILRI, actually, this approach has been pioneered many decades ago. It's not new, but it's become some kind of a buzzword now in the media. We have to use a One Health approach. Okay, but what does it mean? So the One Health approach comes from veterinary science because vets have been trained on keeping animals healthy because most of them are food for humans. So the main motivation in veterinary science, keep animals healthy so the human consumers are also healthy. So mainly food producing animals. We have appreciated now, I think, the collaboration with the human medical scientists or the medical practitioners because of the existence of zoonotic diseases. And as of late, we are also trying to collaborate much better with the environment health specialists on understanding ecosystem drivers and changes and impacts. But we need more than this. We don't just need the biomedical science, not just vaccines and diagnostics and people who understand infectious diseases. We also need the social sciences. We need to understand behaviors. Why are people eating the food they're eating? Why are they not cooking milk? Why do they go hunting, for example? All these things, we need to understand them better. We also need to understand the political system, to understand the political willingness. As Prof was saying yesterday, we have many solutions to many problems, but often political willingness is very low. And we need to understand incentives, drivers, motivators to change behavior. And basically, the core of this concept is be prepared. So we understand the transmission patterns of diseases. Coronaviruses have been there for 100 years. We know how to detect them, and we theoretically know how to respond, but we need to have this in place before the next pandemic. And controlling zoonotic diseases is much, much cheaper in animals than once we have an outbreak like the COVID pandemic we're having now. So finally, I want to close. I want to say that COVID was a warning sign by Mother Nature, and it's just preparing us for the next for another pandemic. We know it's coming. There'll be more spillover events, and it might be a disease more severe. On that list of 9 diseases that was published by the World Health Organization, these are the 9 candidate diseases that have the potential for a next pandemic. And many of those are hemorrhagic fevers, like those nasty diseases, you know, from movies like Outbreak, that cause internal bleedings. They are transmitted by ticks and by mosquitoes. And this is not to give you any fear, but we have to be prepared for those scenarios. And COVID was a very big warning sign. And I want to say that there's also silent pandemics, those that don't kill with a lot of noise, like what we see on the news these days. But we do have antimicrobial resistance, not just antibiotic resistance, but resistance to insecticides, pesticides, parasitic diseases that will catch up with us over the next few decades as well. And we have to be prepared for that. So with this, I want to close. Thank you very much for the attention. Andy is back. I hope he is bringing some questions, and I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everybody enjoyed this super interesting talk. I think it gave a lot of insights. And we prepared some questions and got some questions from the audience, and I would just hand them over. But first I would start, like we had a chit chat beforehand, and you said COVID-19 was not a surprise for you. So you saw, so to say, already things before. Why it wasn't a surprise?
Yeah, so as I said, coronaviruses, they have been around in veterinary medicine for a while. They have been affecting poultry, they have been affecting pigs. We knew there's coronaviruses in bats. We knew that for some time. And that's also, to me, when people say, how is it possible that science came up with a vaccine that quickly? It's possible because scientists, biomedical scientists from different disciplines, veterinary science, but also human medical professionals came together, and we were already working on this, So they already know this is what we have to look for when we do a PCR. This is how coronaviruses behave, mutation rates. We shared equipment like sequencers. So we were prepared for this. I think, yeah.
You're saying you're working super interdisciplinary. That means who is all part of an interdisciplinary work?
Of course, it depends on the question. So you don't need the same people for every question. You need to identify what is my common goal. So, for example, my goal now with my colleagues, we want to fight a certain neglected tropical diseases like the pork tapeworm. I'm going to talk about it in the workshop on Wednesday with the students. So this is our problem. We know where we want to go. And then we need to see what are the disciplines that we need. Of course, we need parasitologists because it's a parasitic disease, but we also need public health specialists because there's a lot related to community sanitization. There's a lot to do with culture of using toilets and washing hands. There's a lot to do with the political willingness because there's vaccines available, there's mass drug administration, yet the problem is still there. So you have a problem, this is what I want to solve, and then you need to identify the stakeholders and you need to speak the same language somehow. Don't be too technical, and that's also, I think, egos in science. We all have our disciplines. We like to talk in fancy words, but we need to find a common way of talking and understanding each other. That's a starting point, I would say. Yeah. And I mean, an example was in the Ministry of Health in Kenya, when they accredited laboratories that were able to do PCRs and in Kenya for COVID testing. And there are not too many. So our veterinary lab, we're following the same processes. So we were really happy to be able to help the Ministry of Health, even though we're doing veterinary research. So that's also interdisciplinary. Yeah.
So it's super important. One question that was asked is how is a zoonotic disease traced? How is it reported? How you find out that it's a zoonotic disease and not something that came out of, so to say, human body?
Okay, so there's something we call a phylogenetic analysis. So now with this new technology like sequencing of the whole genome of pathogens, and you have samples from different animals, but also from humans, from the ecosystem, and you can really look at the genetic information and you can see how it's related to each other. And then you can even say this was the one in the pangolins or the bats was there before it emerged in humans, for example. So this is how you can say there must have been a spillover event at some point. You might not be able to trace it back to the date, but you might as well be. But more than 2/3 of the infectious diseases we see in humans, they have their origins in animals. So there was a spillover event at some point. And I mentioned HIV. If you look at it, it was a zoonotic disease because it jumped from non-human primates to humans. But now it's no longer really a zoonotic disease because human-to-human transmission is the most critical transmission pathway. Same with COVID. But bovine tuberculosis, for example, which is a problem in many low and middle income countries, is transmitted from milk to humans, from cow milk. And that's a classical zoonotic disease. Up to today, it's the same transmission pathway from the milk to humans. Yeah.
So you're a little bit like detectives trying to find where it comes from and then to break the chain.
Exactly. And even in livestock research, what we do now, I work in Uganda, for example. Uganda is a beautiful country with a lot of different ecosystems, wildlife, very good climate. It's favorable for all kinds of pathogens, but also crops, fruits, vegetables. So we were looking, for example, into pigs. Pig keeping is a very new business. Well, not extremely new, but relatively new compared to cattle keeping, which is a very traditional business in Africa. So, and pigs are very closely with humans, right? We use the pancreas, for example, for insulin production. We use the valves of the heart from pigs for transplanting them into humans. They are monogastric, so we have a lot of similarities. So we were looking at Ebola antibodies, for example, in pigs, because Ebola is a disease that causes a number of epidemics now and then in Uganda, but the government knows how to handle them. But we wanted to know, are there any additional reservoirs that we have to consider in disease surveillance? So yeah, we are trying to look into livestock species as sentinels for those zoonotic diseases to help preventing another spillover event.
And if something like this happened and you find out there's Ebola come in or something, is there any resilience, anything where you get to know it, and what are the next steps? So if you find out there's Ebola coming, what is the normal things you try to contain, that it's not like going to a pandemic like we have it now, but to...
Yeah, so I don't think it's us vets containing Ebola. It's really the ministries of health. And so what usually happens, they are trying to trace the index case, which means they want to try and find out, okay, where was the first person that died of Ebola, so they can sort of contain the disease in that area. Zero. Yeah, because some strains of Ebola, they are more contagious than others. So those strains that are very contagious or virulent, as we call it, people might not even make it to the next hospital. They just die, But others, they might survive longer, so they can reach to the next urban center, and then a country might be in trouble. But I was in Uganda during one outbreak, for example, and I felt very comfortable the way the ministry was handling it. There was public awareness. Stay where you are, wash the hands, social distancing, similar to what we do now. And yeah, this is how it was contained. But if we, for example, do our research and we find Ebola antibodies in pigs, we usually report it back to the authorities. We give them information on how we test it. What do these test results mean? Because it's, if you find antibodies, what does it mean now? Does it mean the pigs are carrying the infection, or does it just mean they were in contact with it? So yeah, this is the kind of interaction we have. Yeah. And in some diseases like Rift Valley fever, which also emerged in East Africa, it's a mosquito-borne disease. In Germany, for example, we have the mosquito species that could be competent to carry the virus. So it's good to have this collaboration already with countries in Africa where the disease is endemic, to study it, and it helps us to prepare for outbreaks here in Germany. Even now, we're not thinking of Rift Valley fever, but it might be here in the future. Same with African swine fever.
Keep fingers crossed that not.
Fingers crossed, yeah, but it's better. Yeah, I think we can try and do wishful thinking, but it's
That's
also
for sure.
good to be realistic and be prepared, So, yeah, to know your enemy.
Yeah, that's right. We also had some questions about concerning COVID-19, and there's still the question whether it's a zoonosis or whether it comes from a laboratory or something. Do you know anything of these things? Because, I think there's a lot of rumors around the internet, and
So our program co-leader in ILRI, Hung Nguyen, he is actually from Vietnam, and he was part of the WHO mission who went to Wuhan and who did all these investigations.
What actually they did? I mean, we always see the pictures of coming with the bus and then leaving with the bus.
Yeah, so what they were doing, they were, of course, they were assessing the laboratories, like biosecurity, how likely is it that a virus can escape from the lab, or what are the containment security levels of these laboratories? And they were looking at the records, like basically going back, how was the index case reported, what was done after, So what the mission reported back, that it was not very likely that it is a laboratory engineered virus, because we know coronaviruses have been circulating in bats and pangolins for quite some time. So they said the spillover through hunting or eating or handling infected meat is more likely, but they will not be able to probably say exactly what happened at that point. So investigations, they are still continuing, but that was at least the essence of the mission at the time, And you said, is it a zoonosis, and what was the spillover event? So it's still hypothesized if bats were maybe a reservoir, and then another animal was infected and hunted, and the meat was handled. So I think that mission leaned more towards the natural spillover event than laboratory engineering. Yeah, but I see every day there's different news on the internet. It's kind of confusing,
In that sense, but it's natural science, how it works.
And it's good to try and trace back the origins, but now also, okay, what does it? It doesn't change anything. It's there now, and we have to deal with it, right? So,
That's right. Coming back a little bit maybe to the topic of ISWI 2021 about climate change and natural resources and so on. So you pointed out the drivers of the whole thing, and that zoonosis become more likely. What would you advise us as students, as people who want to also shape the world a bit and also want to live a little bit more longer in this world? What to do about these things to make it less likely that we have spillovers?
Yeah. Well, to echo the speaker yesterday, I think, globally, it's the political willingness that has to be there. All the solutions are there. But at an individual level, like the students or, like everyone who wants to make a difference, I would say buy local, moderate consumption, especially in high-income countries, moderate consumption of animal source protein. Vaccination against infectious diseases that are there. Yes.
And interdisciplinary work.
Definitely interdisciplinary work. Even as a student, I think you're right. Even as a student, be open for what other disciplines have to say and try to work together on common problems. Like a vet cannot solve all the problems. I have to work with IT. I have to work with political scientists. We work with economists, to understand the problem, because it's not just about a pathogen. It's about the context of a disease. Yeah.
Okay. With this, I think we are nearly done. And I want to thank you once again for this great talk. I think we have done a big summary of this. There is a workshop on Wednesday with you. Could you shortly present what you like to invite the people to?
Yeah, so on Wednesday, I wanted to talk with the students about a disease. We call it a neglected tropical disease. It's also zoonotic, so it's transmitted between animals and humans, and it causes a high burden, but it's not like a very noisy disease like COVID or Ebola. Mm-hmm. It's something that is really confined in low-income settings, very much poverty alleviated. We have all the biomedical solutions. So on paper, we should be able to control that disease, but we're not. So I want to introduce the students into the context of that disease, and maybe leveraging a little bit from what Technical University of Ilmenau has in stock, and get some ideas on how they would solve that that problem. Yeah, so that's what I want to discuss with the students.
Okay, so if you are interested, it's then on Wednesday, the 1st of June. So, no, 2nd of June. Yeah, sorry. And it's from 2 to 3. And you can just join this. Just go to our website, 2021.iswi.org, and there you can find also the sessions from the workshop. Once again, thank you for this great talk. And we hope that you had some fun, some insights, and study hard so to prevent the next zoonosis.
And work together. Exactly. Thank you so much.
Welcome.